Damage over time, better known as DOT, is a DPS archetype known for non-critical damage that withers the opponent's HP over the course of the fight. Since our last DOT video, quite literally nothing would change for a whole year post-release of Black Swan until the most recent limited character release of Highlands. Where has DOT been for the past year? In this video, I hope to answer that question. This video is sponsored by Loot Bar. I was able to save on Stellar Jades with the cheaper prices they have compared to the typical in-game top-up version. The process is very safe and simple as it takes cheapest conversion currency rate and then presents to you many discounted prices, which you can then use with various coupons to save on an even more amount of Stellar Jades. The transaction is smooth and simple. Enter your UID in the top right corner. Once you choose your preferred method of payment, you will within a matter of moments receive your purchased Unnerric shards, which you can then convert to Stellar Jades. One thing I like about Loot Bar is that you get the first time top up bonus for your Stellar Jades, which is a massive help when it comes to making the videos, because that means more pools for the random character. Check out the link in the description to save on your Stellar Jade purchases, and thanks again to Loot Bar for sponsoring this video. Black Swan's release in 2.0 would bring DOT to a placement among the best teams in the in-game contents. Unlike other team compositions at the time, DOT was the only playstyle that was universally viable across all contents. You have to take into consideration, Super Break wasn't a playstyle in the game at the time, and Acheron hadn't released yet either. So for a whole patch, DOT would be indisputably the best team comp you could play in the whole game, for both memory chaos and pure fiction. What made Black Swan and Kafka DOT so powerful compared to the other playstyles in the game for pure fiction specifically was the constant AoE and application of DOT from the two damage dealers. Whenever an enemy would come into the field, they would automatically take Arcana stacks from Black Swan, which made this team perfect for the constant spawn of enemies. What you have to also take into consideration is that DOT would be a lot easier to build comparative to the other team comps in the game, which made this team a lot quicker in hitting the damage ceiling compared to your traditional hypercarry team. This archetype would dominate the in-game contents despite being niche, and the reasoning behind this would be the fact that DOT characters are the least flexible characters in the game and don't have massive damage spikes, whereas instead consistent damage over the course of the fight. DOT, weirdly enough, would find value with the release of Acheron in patch 2.1, and for the simple reason of the other DOT characters being nihility to fill the criteria of Acheron's passive. It also helped that Black Swan did apply Defense Shred with her elemental skill, but by no means was the double DOT composition best in slot for Acheron. It was at least the rare opportunity for DOT to have a team that was somewhat unintended for a use case. This team would go on to clear memory and chaos and pure fiction even easier because Acheron was the best damage dealer of AoE at the time of her arrival. Kafka and Black Swan were able to place a debuff on the enemy every single turn, and both were a part of the nihility path. The only issue would be the skill point consumption and replacement of Ruame in the team compositions. So for 2 patches, DOT would be a meta-dominant playstyle alongside hypercarry Acheron. Both teams were great in all respective contents, but more importantly, around this point in Honkai style, every team comp was actually viable in the in-game contents. The easiest to build, easiest to pilot, and most satisfying playstyle would soon be met with the release of the Super Break composition. The Super Break comp could rival the damage over time comp in both damage per second, ease of use, and time taken to reach the damage ceiling build-wise. This comp following Firefly's release in 2.3 would have 2 additional benefits over DOT. Super Break could be built with less premium characters, and in actuality, it worked just as well with the contents that lacked fire weakness, as Firefly could implant the fire weakness. DOT's damage tremendously suffered whenever the enemy had a lot of resistances to the lightning and wind elements, making Black Swan and Kafka DOT harder to use in the in-game contents. This would become more and more prevalent as the patches went on, but for the time being, there was at least some. Pure fiction would remain the same, and in general, since enemies didn't have as much health, the resistances for the DOT team wasn't as important as for the memory of chaos. Firefly Super Break would dominate the meta as being the overall best team in the game. While all other teams in the meta took a hit, Black Swan DOT would however be hit the hardest. We could argue popularity of character matters, and the ownership rate of Firefly compared to Kafka is exponentially higher, but at the same time it just isn't the same. The Black Swan DOT would find more value in the release of Robin in the second half of 2.3. Robin was essentially a Harmony character that was best in slot and follow-up in hypercarry teams. Despite Robin having tailor-made buffs for those teams, she had a very flexible kit for attack scalers, which would allow her to take the place of Ruan Mei and DOT teams. Robin gave a ton of attack and action advancing to the whole team, which would give her a lot of value with Kafka and Black Swan DOT. The clear times could in theory be better and promote more sustain less comps, which would matter more in the future, but for Robin for now, there was another character that could take the place of an indefinite staple of the core DOT team. As time went on, the DOT archetype would fall more and more out of the meta. Not to say you couldn't use this team to clear content, we hadn't reached that point yet, but the team just wasn't as good to use as it once was. With the release of more and more characters, that was to become more prevalent. It makes a lot of sense for this to be the fate of the DOT team comp. It was always niche to begin with, much like Mono Quantum. The only difference is that this team comp had a better foundation for future releases. It could still arguably have more room for improvements. If you take into account, the DOTs can't crit yet. There is also the thing to take into consideration that Physical Bleed being the best DOT didn't have a user that could apply an AoE. There was Luca, but he was single target. This would mean that DOT would fade into obscurity, with there being zero direct updates to this entire composition for a year plus months. In fact, it almost feels as if Hoyoverse would forget about the DOT comp entirely and move on to other avenues. The DOT composition as wasn't worth investing further into, which made a lot of sense as to why Hoyoverse didn't even bother rerunning these two niche characters. At the very least, content could still be cleared, but that's for the time being, as that could very much change in the future. It actually did get to a point in Honkai Star as the overall damage of DOT couldn't keep up with the enemy's health increases over time, especially when you take into account the enemy resistances. This was only either memory chaos though, as DOT was still very prevalent in pure fiction. This was the content that DOT was always known to be premier in, and it's still good to know that that's always going to remain the same. However, the DOT team would feel lackluster to what was currently meta in the in-game content, and this notion would change with the reveal of future Kafka buffs in a brand new physical nihility character, Highlands. In patch 3.4, there would be the release of a new planar set, one tailor-made for Finon and the other tailor-made for DOT characters. The new planar set gave more attack percentage and DOT damage dealt than the overall amount that was given by Glamoff set. The criteria was different, so there wasn't as bad of a stat breakpoint needed. While this was an overall net buff to the DOT team, it meant farming for an already completed team was kinda iffy, but with the later release of Highlands, the investment would be made worth it. In the same patch would be buffs for Kafka alongside other characters. The Kafka buffs were massive for the character. In fact, they were game-changing and made Kafka an even better support-eccentric character for the DOT team, whereas she was the main damage dealer / detonator up to this point. Kafka received an additional follow-up attack having up to 2 per turn, and a resettable one after using her ultimate. Her elemental skill now detonated the DOT on the 3 characters she hit with her blast attack, and her ultimate also did more shock / detonation damage. Those were the best buffs for the character in general, but even her Eidolons would receive buffs that helped the character scale better with vertical investment, which is not bad at all considering DOT remaining in this niche forever. These buffs at least made her an overall better damage dealer and now better supporter following the release of Highlands in patch 3.5 first half. Highlands is the physical bleed DOT character that seems to be a hybrid of both Black Swan and Kafka. Highlands can lower the enemy's defenses, decrease their attack, increase her own damage dealt by building effect hit rate, and also detonate DOTs much like Kafka. This alone can make her an ideal replacement of Black Swan, but also a major component of a triple DOT team setup. Considering Bleed dealt max health damage and Highlands could apply this on the AoE, it was important to have her in your DOT teams for the future, as she would get better as the enemies became tankier. The Kafka DOT buffs were perfect timing and would give the DOT team yet another spot in the meta, which is a long time coming, mind you. The last time DOT was actually a part of the meta will be back in 2.0, which is a year and months ago at the time of recording. I think following the release of this powerhouse and very much needed staple, I don't think we'll be making videos on the DOT team for the foreseeable future. So I think in all honesty, this may be the last, but I consider it a happy ending at least. The only thing in the pipelines for DOT team, in all honesty, that makes the most sense would be letting DOT's crit with a future Harmony character, which would bring this archetype to even higher heights, or honestly even a Harmony that also gave DOT teams a ton of free break effect, which in my opinion isn't something a part of the DOT archetype that has been tapped into. Thank you for watching, and have a nice rest of your day.